Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lisa Sass from Enterprise Studio by HCL Technologies. Today, we have a panel of cybersecurity experts who will be discussing privileged access management in the context of zero trust. This topic is particularly relevant as PAM becomes much more visible with the rampant exploits and ransomware today. So each of our panelists brings very deep expertise with a wide range of experiences across multiple regions and multiple industries. So please plan to stay for the Q&A at the end of the session. Our panelists will welcome your questions. You can submit your questions in the Ask a Question window, and we will answer them at the end of the discussion. Or you can always email your questions to enterprisestudio@hcl.com, and we will respond after the session. So after the session, you will also find some additional information about today's panelists and about today's topics in the attachment section. So joining us today on the panel, we have Aaron Benaitia, who's our guest moderator and facilitator for the panel. He is the founder and CEO of SAT Incorporated and has more than 20 years of experience in the security industry. He has presented in such forums as Gartner, IAM, Coppinger-Cole European Identity and Cloud Conference, and he's also developed a transformational solution, ID Hub. He's also built an organization from the ground up and been featured in CIO Review magazine. We also have Joe Burke. He is the chief architect for Semantic PAM, and he is with Broadcom Incorporated. His expertise is particularly welcome today because he has been the chief architect for the solution since its early origins, the acquisition of Exedium by CA Technology, to modernizing it. He brings significant experience leading cybersecurity solution implementations, including financial verticals and PaaS and SaaS. We also have Robert Van Beveren. He is a practicing solutions architect in the SecArch practice for Enterprise Studio and EMEA. He has worked with a wide range of customers across Europe for more than 25 years and has extensive experience leading solution visioning and design all the way through implementations. And finally, we're joined by Sesh Ramasharma. He is the global head of identity security for Enterprise Studio by HCL Technologies. He also brings decades of experience to the conversation, delivering program management and advisory services to organizations of all kinds, all industries, all complexities. And he has also worked across multiple vendor solutions in all areas of identity security. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Aaron, and let's start this discussion knowing that it's going to be a very lively one. So, Aaron, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much for getting us started. I am super excited to be here talking about zero trust, privileged access management, two pretty interesting, important things in security space these days. And going to explore all of these things with our panelists and pick their brains and see how things go. So before we get started about talking about zero trust and PAM, let's talk about what are they. So I'm going to just ask each of you to explain what zero trust is. What do you think zero trust is, and how do you explain it to our audience? So what is zero trust architecture, Joe?
Sure. So zero trust isn't a single thing. It's really a lens that's applied to all layers of technologies, whether it's your network, your servers, your desktops, databases, applications, and even your code. Zero trust isn't just, is pervasive across all of those, right? And it's really a system of beliefs of the way to approach identity and authorization. At its core, zero trust is nothing is trusted, which sounds kind of obvious, but whether it's a firewall configuration, API call, access to a server, these are all controlled and audited centrally. That is one of the key things that zero trust applies, is that not only can you prevent it, but you can also understand what has happened across it. The fundamental assumption here is that some kind of actor, whether it's an employee, a contractor, a hacker, a process, what have you, will end up inside your environment. And zero trust helps set that foundation so that no authorizations or access can be assumed. right? I mean, we often see that keys are misplaced and then used and abused and whatnot, and Zero Trust helps take that part of it away, or if it is found, it's invalid and can't be used going forward. A lot of our customers take a multi-pronged approach, PAM along with advanced and adaptive identity techniques, API coverage and governance are cores to a successful Zero Trust architecture. And a mature PAM product, in my opinion, should cover both what we call the coarse and fine-grained types of authorizations. Coarse grain would be things like a proxy and a vault, where access is often facilitated, either over credentials or secrets or what have you. But then fine grain operates even at the kernel level and even as an agent on a server that can control processes and users from getting any kind of elevated privilege.
Quite a lot of things to understand and digest. So how about you, Sesh? What do you think, and how do you explain Zero Trust?
Well, Zero Trust is simply put in a summary is never trust, always verify. That pretty much is the essence of Zero Trust. The idea of having to have everybody verify before they perform any actions on any asset essentially is the key to Zero Trust, right? So I think PAM is a very relevant topic in that sense. And the key tenets, like if you look at NIST SP 800-207 publication, if you look at it, or Forrester, or even Gartner models, ZTX model for Forrester, all of them have certain tenets in it, right? The key tenets of Zero Trust you can boil down to, apart from never trust, always verify. Few things are like visibility and analytics are key. They recommend automation and orchestration capabilities that essentially we'll see how it evolves into any solution for that matter. Segmentation, that's a key. It might be a network concept, but it goes beyond that. And then compliance. Those are aspects that all these models essentially cover. So that's a quick, in a nutshell, view of Zero Trust from my perspective.
Robert, how do you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, with Joe's and Sesh's explanation, there's not much more to add. I mean, for me, it is a thing you do in your company. It goes across the estate, so not just technology. It needs to be supported by processes and procedures. So, yeah, as Joe said, ultimately it hits your information. That's what you're trying to protect, but it's also part of your physical security. How do you secure your buildings? How do you secure assets, even down to the point of even in your racks, for instance, who has access to them, and how do you make sure that the right people have the right level of access all the time, whatever they need to do. And yeah, as has been repeated a number of times, never trust, always verify. Start with the point of, yep, who are you? Why are you here? What are you trying to do? And what do you claim to be able to do? And verify that against your single source of truth, be that a vault, be that something else.
So thank you for all of that. I mean, I like to use metaphors, and I think I like to use an airport like a metaphor of a Zero Trust. If you're challenged pretty much almost at every step of the way, going into the airport to the check-in, X-rays. If you are a airport mechanic, you have different various checkpoints, access to the plane is controlled as a passenger, as a pilot, as a groundskeeper. So you have different levels of access, and you're challenged pretty much at every source, every checkpoint. And so Zero Trust in a more of a digital word would be a metaphor. An airport could be a metaphor. Would you agree? Something similar for people who don't understand the level of Zero Trust and the technicality that we understand. It's pretty much enforcing controls almost at every different place. You're not, even though you enter the airport, secure perimeter as a baggage handler, everything, every step of the way, you have to present your credentials and get in and tell you who you are. Okay. So let's talk about privilege access management. We talk about not trusting anybody, but not trusting anybody. How somebody you got to trust is got to be a circle of trust. And how does privilege access management help enable zero trust. Zero trust, we're checking everybody, again, just trying to connect our audience to where they are coming from. We're checking everything everywhere in the context with your credentials, single source, all of these things. It's great. PAM, privileged access management, helps us do a lot of implement those controls. So, Joe, if you want to just can you elaborate on how privileged access management helps you implement zero trust and what it is and how does it implement it?
Sure, and you hit the nail on the head, right? So any PAM solution will enhance a company's control plane and also governance plane at the end of the day, providing consistency, one-stop shopping for how you meet against your auditors, your regulators, or your internal compliance teams and procedures. But ultimately, the information that's inside of there is highly encrypted and inside of a vault. And access to that information is, authorized by policies to enable employees on a need-to-know basis, right? So, let's say you and I are on the same team. I am the baggage handler, as you would call it. You're the pilot, right? So we have different levels of access. We can control that through our policies inside of PAM. And that works across whether you're in an enterprise or whether you're in a hybrid environment, right? Across the clouds and what have you. So. Most PAM products, especially ours, leads with a zero trust, and we do least privileged approach, right? So anything that you put into the vault, it's hidden, and users are only going to be able to see that when they are authorized to do it, right? So it's by explicit grant as opposed to implicit grant. In addition to that, we also hide things, right? While that sounds bad, but at the end of the day, if you're logging into a server as, let's say, a root user, we will auto log in on your behalf and never release the credential back to you or the secret back to you, so it's never known by you, but yet you're using it.
Sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned a couple of things. I think we can elaborate a little bit more.
Sure.
Controls plane and governance plane.
Yep.
I think I understand what you're saying, but if you can elaborate and why use that model for people who don't understand controls plane, governance plane, and especially in a zero trust and PAM. How does it's probably where the rubber meets the road. It's like, so can you explain what you meant by controls?
Yeah,
plane
sure.
And
So
governance
absolutely. Plane? So probably the simplest example I can give is how do you log into a server, right? Where I can use a password, or I can be set up as a password. I can set up as a key, right, and put something in the authorized key file. I might have even a cert that allows me to have a short time token to be able to get in. All of those are essentially the same result to be able to get into a server. And so when you talk about a control plane, you were giving companies the ability to set those standards, right? We don't want any credentials, we don't want any passwords, we only want keys. We don't want any keys, we only want certs. And they can adjust and tune the level of security that they're comfortable with, both from a compliance as well as an operational perspective. Right, so that's the control side of it. In addition to that, I can make sure that only key people in the organization have access to use those vaulted items, right? And that's a key thing that, I'm not going to be able to have a key be passed around or put on a shared drive somewhere or a thumb drive. I'm going to have it controlled inside of my vault, and I'm only going to give access when it's being requested and only if authorized, right? So that's the control side. On the governance side, typically a lot of our customers have to go through very rigorous regulatory and compliance policies where the managers and the manager is signing off on all the employee activity at the end of the day, right? So ensuring that there's proper change control, proper authorizations, making sure that folks that are authorized are supposed to be authorized or should remain authorized, so you don't have long-standing privileges or if you transfer departments, you don't end up with the access from your old department anymore. Those are things that allow for the governance side of it, where people can look at it, monitor it, attest to it, and ultimately sign off on understanding the risks that they're working with.
I'm just gonna dig a little bit deeper. I've worked in compliance a lot, and here's the interesting part: compliance and the governance plane and controls. It's probably the first time I'm looking at those terms and these words. When these words in place, governance, I understand what when a whole bunch of regulators, lawyers, people who who sit down and say, here's what ought to be. A simple governance would be something simple as if you are terminated, if an employee is terminated, their access needs to be removed in 24 hours. That's a governance statement. Like it's easy to understand for people, a lawyer speak, probably more complicated, but if this happens in English, that governance should be applied. And controls plane would be a privileged access management or any management system goes in and yanks out the credentials from that. So that's connecting what the governance happens and what the technical controls happen and marrying them together. I'm just going to pick on our other panelists here with Sesh. Do you want to add on to how the PAM PAM helps us connect our governance and our controls? Because what we want and what we have, sometimes there's a lot of drift between them. And how does PAM help us with getting the zero trust? Zero trust is, again, more of a governance. It says, trust nobody, control everything, get the context. How does PAM help you put the governance of zero trust and the control together?
Yeah. As Joe kind of hit on key points there. As I said earlier, the key tenets of zero trust being visibility, analytics, automation, orchestration, compliance, and segmentation. If you take a look at each of those elements, I can quickly kind of go over like visibility and analytics. Employee access management is pretty straightforward. If you look at what PAM does, essentially like got hooks into your DevOps, CI/CD pipeline, right from that to access to administrative accesses to systems, logging into the operating system level or into a database level or into an application and administrative role. Any level, right? You're looking into it, the fact that there's some level of control that you can govern through, govern and control are kind of slightly different sense, like Joe pointed out. The control essentially is around creating policies and essentially implementing the policies. Governance is around verifying the policies, around making sure that there's appropriate policies and also separation of duty to a degree, because the people who are governing these policies should not have access and vice versa, right? People who have access, if they control the policies and dictate how things are done, the governance aspect of it, you don't want it. You want some level of separation aspects of it in there as well. So essentially, the point is that visibility, analytics, aspects of privileged access manager, a solution like that, and any orchestration or automation. The key is manual controls are going to be very error prone. Any little automation is going to make that a lot more. You get a control over the situation, and you can appropriately put better governance over it, right? So you see the difference between the two terms that are being used here. And segmentation, obviously, there is no meaning for organizational perimeters anymore, right? In the cloud world and there's no perimeter anymore. Everything has gone out, and you need micro perimeters around assets, and that's where the segmentation come in. And essentially, when you gain control of credentials in privileged access management, and essentially, lock them up, essentially release it only on a need basis, and that too, in this case, Joe, illustrated a point where he's saying that we are going to proxy you. We are not going to give you the credential. You want to do this? I'll proxy you into the endpoint. So it does a lot of segmentation, and then aspects of reporting, logging, any compliance-oriented things come as a side effect, as a benefit, right? Because that's all required. Visibility is key. So that's a quick summary of how Privileged Access Manager really fits in this particular realm.
So would you say Privileged Access Manager more lies on the controls plane, helps you trace the governance policies in the controls plane, adds visibility, adds different controls like not sharing passwords, not you said session brokering, proxying? Injecting.
All of that comes into play.
Okay. I'm going to slightly twist this for Robert. Robert, so here's, again, going from a governance perspective, I'm thinking a board of a large organization, a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, comes in tells the CIO, make us secure, you make us secure. guarantee me, assure me that you are secure. The CIO says, well, we've got to have our SOX, our NERC SIP or HIPAA, whatever the regulations is. These are the best practice ISO 27K, and let's go ahead and implement this. It goes on down the command and says, well, we can do all of this thing, and part of it is zero trust. Help us understand, our audience understands, going back all the way to how do you assure, there's no provables or provable security, how do you assure a higher level of trust or a higher level of assurance of security with PAM when the governance and where the control, they meet with PAM? Do you follow what my question is? If not, just I can repeat. So PAM is the control. Go ahead, anybody.
Yeah, well, you've got your right. So I have to admit, I'm not quite sure where you're going with the question. However, I'll give it a whirl. For me, PAM, obviously, you've got for starters, when you've got this scenario, as a CIO, you need to set up the governance framework. What do you want to achieve in your, whatever your security model is that you want to do? And if you haven't got one, then you have to go out and make one or create it or otherwise establish it. That in its own right is a complete exercise to actually go through your entire business and set up what are the assets we want to secure, what is their value, do we rate them 1 to 5, 1 to 6, whatever. There's all sorts of things out there where people are saying,
this is governance plane. Yes.
Yeah, it's the governance plane. So you set that up. You can then, once you've got that, you can then look at your PAM and say, okay, that's my governance. How do I want to control that? And then you can go into PAM and develop all your policies and set that all up. And then the PAM then allows you to apply that consistently across whatever you've come across. So it automates things. You can have a very complicated governance piece, but if you then implement your policies, then you can hand over your administration to people who may not necessarily be fully aware of your governance framework, but because they know the policies, they will follow that and they will implement that. So it allows you all that automation and that consistency.
Any examples? Any of you can give us?
Yeah, I have one.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So a governance policy might say something to the effect of, for anybody to access our production environments, a VP has to sign off on it before they can log in, right? So that's the governance, and that's the control objective that they want to get to. The control implementation is in PAM. So let's say Sesh has access to root at some server. He goes to click on it to auto log in, and next thing you know, he has to wait for his manager to approve an email or come into the system and approve it himself. And once that happens, he has it for a defined period of time for, let's say, a 2-hour window.
Okay.
Right. So PAM is providing the consistency of controls, the consistency of workflow in a lot of cases, whereas it's meeting the control objectives and or exceeding the control objectives that are being pushed by the company.
So the manager can go back, the VP can go back to CIO and say, we are more secure because every production is authorized by me, which CIO can go to the board, we are secure. We are getting more secure. So it's an excellent example. And any other examples that we can all relate, that can be easily relatable. We understand. So, Sesh, you talked about visualization or reporting.
Those are more sophisticated aspects. Like as time progresses, you can use intelligence to essentially drive policies. The governance now becomes a lot more easy for organizations. For example, they can look for patterns of behavior. User behavior is a very good example of this. You record the fact that a particular administrator has got certain types of behavior, and you realize that there are some loopholes that in control aspects of it have not been plugged. That becomes relevant when you start analyzing your logs, understanding what your policies are, looking in the context of it. Maybe there's something to be locked down further. And that you realize in some level of artificial intelligence, I would say, or machine learning kind of algorithms, as things are evolving and aging, And it's called analytics orientation, right? And I think some products have things like threat analysis, has some dynamicity, dynamic aspect to the whole thing. Like, intelligently you go fix so there's some level of governance aspect that can be automated as well. So I think there's some in the reporting realm, right, starting from analyzing the report manually, you may start low, but as sophistication increases and you're able to layer and products are able to do these things, policies can be locked down, used to lock down and gain control of it. So it's a beautiful ecosystem, I would say. It's just evolving.
So I would going back to the airport example, I see the baggage handlers using the parts warehouse to access a shortcut to the outside, and you want to see that, okay, I see an anomaly, and they're allowed to do it. It's policy, it's governance, but hey, this is something that doesn't right because they get access to parts which we don't want them to be accessing and tampering with.
Yeah,
right.
So very interesting example. Yeah.
So along those lines, and Robert, my apologies, I think you wanted to jump in too. In our world, we have a behavioral analytics unit, and our product set, we can detect things like a user who's always logged in from, let's say, the northeast of the United States, but then all of a sudden he's logging in from a country that doesn't have a presence, the company doesn't have a presence in. And so you start to ask the question, are they at a customer site and they're VPNing in? Is that what's going on here? We can raise alerts, raise flags, we can ask for dual approval. We can always session record when they do access something, so we can monitor what's going on. So that behavioral aspect of it, they logged in from somewhere else, or they logged in concurrently from more than 50 miles away from each other in a short period. We can detect those things and certainly take action against them.
So help me understand. I want to explore that just a little further, because I've been hearing that particular use case for, I don't know, 12, 15 years now, about how you're logged in from, say, China, Russia, and Santa Clara at the same time. There's something going on. But the amount of policies, it's more reactive. It's like, okay, how do I'm building a policy for country A, I'm building a policy for region B. And lately we heard a lot about AI being used, machine learning, okay, pattern definition. So let's talk about what have you seen, what do you see in PAM that helps you do this better? Because if I start, otherwise I get a policy fatigue. I mean, how many policies? There are tons and tons of mountains of logs that get turned out, and where do I find my weaknesses? How does PAM or the newer PAM technologies help you do better?
So I certainly have an answer to that, but I'll defer to Robert or Asesh first to give them. I don't want to hog up all the your time.
By all means, go for it. But for me, it would be looking at automation to inspect those reports, to look at what behavior do people have, and track that. So yeah, but I mean, the one comment I wanted to make was Sesh and Joe have referred to it as well. Zero trust is a journey. You can't expect to take an organization from a level 1 trust to 5 or 6 within a short period of time. I mean, obviously a very small organization you can, but Aaron, as you said, a Fortune 500 or 1,000 company, that's unrealistic. It is something that you need to embed in your company.
But my CIO says now. My CIO says now. The board says, well, we need to have now. But my people are logging in from everywhere from Bangalore to Estonia to Florida, and I've got people everywhere. There's no boundaries. So zero trust.
Yes.
That's where I see zero trust principles, the mature levels of maturity increasing, and the policies. Because I think in my own company we've got people. I think by now we are at 15 different cities, or about 15 different cities I can count, where are people that are working out of, and it's all remote. I mean, there's literally no boundaries.
Right.
I haven't seen some of them for a long time and ever. But point I'm trying to make is, how do you put together policies? How do these tools? They can do that, but to do something easily. Just a few more things before I get into the next segue, which is the software-defined perimeter. And if you want to use that's what I hear. The software-defined perimeter is how your perimeter, your firewall perimeter is obviously gone. So how do you do software-defined perimeters? You wanna chime in? Anybody? Sesh?
Yeah, sure. I mean, software-defined perimeter is pretty much like I was saying. In a zero trust, it's paramount because now as we all saw, like you said in your example, and that's the case with most organizations. Not only your people, but your assets are sprawling, right? They're not in one data center anymore, right? You got organizational assets, information assets stored in the cloud, all over the place. You have databases running in, on Azure probably, or some service running in AWS. You got laptops in your organization that need lockdown. Administrative access is all over the place, as you can see. It's like everybody is got access to everything. And at some point, you need to start locking things down. The idea of a software-defined perimeter is to have essentially that can operate at various levels. All the 7 layers of the model. You can have a software-defined perimeter. Essentially, the perimeter is virtual, as you can see. And the perimeter is essentially what you can and cannot do. Right? Essentially, that's what it is. So instead of having a network perimeter saying, okay, I have a DMZ, anything inside DMZ. It's free for all. Anything outside the DMZ, I know there is attack vectors coming in. I'm going to be careful. But those days are gone, and that concept gone into a micro perimeter scenario, and that's where software comes into play. That every one of these accesses need to have some level of to put hardware in every piece of these things. There is no solution like that. Now, software is basically come up with excellent creative ways, privileged access management being one of them, particularly that closes down some of the perimeters down, particularly the administrative and elevated privileges down. Access, that's going to be the key. So that becomes a paramount concept in overall governance of these controls. I yield the floor to my colleagues further.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple on that, right? If you look at the DevOps revolution that's happened and the rise of automation, hardware couldn't keep up. Deploying out new servers and new racks into a data center was a months-long endeavor, and oftentimes, and so now the software has enabled the speed and the rate of change to be a lot faster. That has certainly helped both destroy the outer perimeter to get to those micro perimeters, as Sesh said, but then also to provide the greatest amount of flexibility to customize on a I'll call it element basis on how you want to control it, right? And that's where, whether it's people coming in, whether it's processes coming in, whether it's applications accessing databases, all of that gets governed and pushed through, and PAM is at the core of all of that.
Right. So let me ask, Robert, you being an architect, let's talk about something very interesting that is leading down to. So an example, we've got Google Workspace, we've got Atlassian, I've got Bitbucket, I've got Google Cloud, and let's start with just this in Pipedrive and then Google Analytics. All of these, they have some touch point, and you go into marketing with Segment and with our CRM, trusting Segments, which is trusting our SMTP service from SendMail to,
right.
There's a whole web of interconnected trust that have been established, and I worry about where the permission leakages might happen. So in a SaaS infrastructure, so people who are talking about DevOps, we have automation that you can change. You do a commit, which goes ahead and pushes things down to all the way to stage, not in production, but all the way into stage. And stage, which is trusting their services for notification, it has credentials. It's an insane web of trust that have become in a zero trust. Right? So all of these are tokenized. And the point I'm trying to get is how do you put PAM in there where these tokens are not available to if not necessary? How do you put the PAM control pane on a web of trust like this with credentials all over the place?
Right. I have to admit that's not something I've been involved in so far. Most of my organizations have been far smaller than that. They've been starting at a much smaller maturity model in terms of just restricting access to their local resources or some of their suppliers. So the whole cloud piece has, as an architect, I haven't really touched that. So
It's complicated, absolutely. I mean,
just
It is
fucking throwing everything in. And, oh my God,
So-
how do we do that?
Robert, you're eager to. Sorry, yeah, Joe, you're eager to.
I think Sesh wanted to jump in. I'll let him go first, and then I'll jump in.
I agree it's a challenging one, and that's exactly where we are in a position to kind of take one step at a time. The point is this, that you cannot boil the ocean idea, right? And you have a web of trust, so you've got to start at understanding what the entry points are, what the touch points are. Right. There's some level of analysis required. I mean, you need to know what your assets are, obviously, right? And as an organization, if you don't gain control of what assets are, you can't protect them. The fact that I don't know there's a server running somewhere in the cloud and that got instantiated at some point in time because my capacity for probably some web traffic what had to be, we had to spin up more. There's some level of control involved in it, right? When you're setting up, capacity increase, for example, in AWS, as an example, you said, or in Google, for example, the dynamic, setup, you have Kubernetes just spins up something up. There's some credentials involved that lets those things happen. And make sure that the point is to understand the assets. You understand what are ephemeral, what are constant assets, what are permanent assets. There's always constant change too, right? You're always, your DevOps is increasing new assets, you're retiring stuff, you're kind of, pushing you. So the idea is that you cannot boil the ocean, but you're going to have to start one step at a time. Like Robert was talking about maturity, and that's the key, right. Is that you can start at, you will be in a chaos situation when you're beginning. Get to step one. Gain control of a few endpoints. Then you get, through learning, as you graduate through your maturity process, you can gain control and lock things down further and further. I would say a graduated approach is key to gaining control like that.
So I typically see customers starting two ways that way, right? And they're absolutely correct where it's a maturity model, but it isn't just one path, right? To date in this conversation, we've talked about users access and how do we grant users the ability to see privileged information or gain privileged access to something. However, there is the automated software side of things as well, the programmatic side of it, if you will, right. Where I am an application and I need a credential to get into a database, and that database has extremely protected information, maybe even company secrets or customer PII or what have you, things that you really want to slow down and make sure that those credentials are rotating very often. Those credentials are, your applications are able to adapt to that change in credential when it does happen. You don't want to be tying a DevOps activity to a security ops activity. And so as you described it, it was, how do you get this whole mesh of things of being able to get them all to work together? Well, you identify the touch points that are using the information. Those are key assets you bring into PAM. You get the targets they're going after, which is also key assets where you have the credentials, passwords, tokens, secrets, what have you. And then from there, you give access to only the things in runtime environments and do so in a runtime kind of manner. Right? You don't, I work a lot with the Kubernetes and containers and everything else, and a lot of people put secrets into environment variables.
Exactly.
Well, it's really not a secret. It's a decodable string that anybody can get access to, provided you have access to the container. Not to mention you change the secret, and now you have to do a whole DevOps activity to be able to recycle everything. Like that's not an ideal place to be. But with runtime access and being able to query out to get the secret right now, that can be done in a very efficient manner, very low overhead, 30, 40 milliseconds at most. And then you can always be in touch, and that way your security team can, operate in any schedule they want to, and your application teams aren't, right? So all that kind of comes into play, through a secrets broker or a credential broker, or one of the components we have is called, an A-to-A, application to application kind of connector.
Non-human accounts, right? That come into play essentially.
Non-human consumers of accounts and credentials. Yes, exactly.
I think that could be a whole session by itself. And
Oh yeah.
sorting out the trusts, and as you said,
Yeah.
you mentioned discovery, because as I just discovered, I went into my DNS records, like, okay, what is this service? Where is it registered to? And I go, oh yeah, this is something I did 6 months ago for a proof of concept, and it's still sticking out there.
Right.
And there's a
Orphaned
discovery thing.
assets. Exactly.
So talk about discovery and assets. How, like, any best practices, anything that you can talk about? Like, how do you sort about? You started very good with discovery. We got to know what we have, the to and from. So,
How do we get started? Sure. So I would look at it from a core screen and then to a fine grain perspective, right? So the core screen would, and again, I know it's a little bit of the overuse of terms, but the core screen would be, I have a VPC environment, I have a data center, and all of a sudden new IPs show up, new VMs show up, and if you go into it with the assumption that even though I have all the controls in place to deploy it through whatever channels and pipelines and workflows that I have, ultimately somebody's going to get in there and try to do something they're not supposed to do. And you can try to stop them, and there's certainly ways to do that, but when you don't stop them, how do you discover it? And that's sort of where I would look at it. It's like the catch-all at the end of it all, at the end of the day. And when you have that catch-all, you can look at things like, oh, I have VMs that have showed up on my network, raise an alert. I have accounts that have shown up on this server that I'm managing, or I have authorized keys that somebody put in there somehow, and I don't really know how. I don't really care how right now. I just want to get in there and either get rid of them or to change them, rotate them, so that we can they can lose their access, and now I'm controlling it, right? So that to me always has to be a continuous process, right? That has to almost be running and scanning daily, monthly, hourly, sometimes depending upon the nature of your environment. And
it'd be nice if you had, if at the end of the thing we could probably just collect some of those best practices and how do you go about starting and going through the journey, because I think a lot of people in the same position with a web of trust and just not knowing how to manage it all, and it could be larger or a small organization. A couple of things I want to touch before I want to go. Just PAM. How do people misunderstand it? What kind of things that you heard, like, oh, this is not PAM, or this is not right about PAM? What's some things that you can say, like, this is not correct about PAM?
So what have you heard? Misconceptions you're asking?
Yeah. What misconceptions about?
Sesh or Robert, do you want to start first?
Well, I think that the primary thing is PAM's going to be a pain in the bum. It's going to stop us from doing whatever we are now used to doing. It's going to make our job impossible.
At least more difficult. I wouldn't say impossible.
No. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, they're the sorts of things you get pushback, certainly from sysadmins who say, look, if I need to take a breath, I need to ask permission first from change management or something along those lines. They're really ridiculous examples, but that's what I've come across. And you then say, look, to be fair, I've been into that position myself, where in a big corporate, somebody came in from outside of the office and said, we're now going to do it this way, and you're going to basically lose root access to your server. My first reaction was,
what? You can't have root?
I can't do my job then. But no, we went through the process, and after a couple of months, I thought, that's wrong. I can't. It works, and it works quite streamlined. It works very, very well. So
it's mostly change control. Then it's mostly letting people get accustomed to the newer way of doing things.
Well, so it's organization managing change, managing people through change. They've got long-established practices, and PAM is going to have to change those. You are taking control.
Very good point.
Yeah, certainly the culture in a company will dictate a lot of things, right? You have the compliance, security culture in one side of the house, and the other side of the house is the operation folks, the SAs that have to jump on and deal with problems very quickly. And whenever you slow the SAs down, they're going to complain. I get it and totally understand. And PAM is an access point that they have to deal with, right? The necessary evil at the end of the day. But what it provides, aside from the consistency and the control, though, is it does prevent people from accidentally doing things they're not supposed to, right? And we're all human. We all make mistakes. I'm not saying anybody's trying to be nefarious, and certainly some people are, but mistakes happen, and it's designed to help to try to control that. I would say what's interesting is we have one customer who their SAs are actually compensated on how fast they can resolve issues. And when they introduced PAM, it was a revolt. I mean, flat out, it was a revolt.
Exactly.
But at the end of the day, it pushed through, and the security compliance side of the world, the benefits outweighed the operational the slowdown that had happened, right? So, there's always going to be that tug of war, and I would say the longest pole in any kind of implementation is that working out which side of the house wins or how do they compromise, and that has nothing to do with PAM, because PAM is the execution arm at the end of the day. Right. But getting the policy and governance and the objectives set, getting the agreements with the operations team is bring your helmet in your mouth, because it's going to be a fun conversations to have.
You just sit down as a project manager, as a therapist between the system administrators and the corporate the compliance admin.
Yes, exactly.
Like, everybody take a breath.
Exactly.
And sometimes here in particular countries here in Europe, but it may not be so much the case in the US, but works councils can exert considerable influence over what you can and can't do with PAM. You've got to get them on board in some ways first before you even can proceed. They can lock the whole thing down.
Yep. No, it's true.
Talking about lockdown, does it become a single point of failure at some point in time?
Great question.
No, it's always when you put controls in place, when the control fails, there's the whole idea of fail safe versus fail miserably, fail unsafely, right? Fail safe essentially is like, in a scenario in a zero trust goal, like in privileged manager, when you fail, you have all your vault is essentially holding all your credentials, and essentially if it is not accessible, therefore this is a very classic example that everybody uses in saying case against PAM, is because what happens is that then the administrative access is completely locked down, and it takes a headache to get back. The idea is that when you put controls like this, you need to plan for and essentially create compensating mechanisms for break glass and other important things that are very key in a solution like this, right? So long as if you consider it carefully and put break glass policies and procedures in place, there's both technical and procedural aspects to break glass. So I didn't want to get into details, specifics of the implementation here. The idea is that yes, it is, and it is important to recognize that it could become a problem if you didn't plan properly for it. So it's a key. It's an important planning consideration, and it's important because corporate assets have to be locked down. And yes, you can see, right, if you look at any of these breaches or latest, ransomware attacks or anything, like, you can take like SolarWinds, for example, under that, there's signature of, exploits of privileged access is very evident in many of these. Like in the 80% of the statistical perspectives, they say, and analysts have been saying, the data bears out that it is. So the fact is that a simple thing like, okay, we're going to be crippled, and therefore we're not going to implement, is going to be a very dangerous position to take. So there are compensating measures that one should take with regard to break glass, plan ahead. That will eventually, help you get over this fear of the single point of failure. I mean, that's the case with most of them, and this resilience need to be built everywhere, right?
Yeah, it's like if you can say that your database goes down, that's a single point of failure. But
exactly, it is a very good point. It's like saying that essentially.
But for me, it's also, yes, PAM is effectively a single point of failure, but how many instances of the system do you have? And most importantly, that vault that you've built, have you replicated that across a number of your sites? Yeah. And at that point, losing the database from a single site doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely locked out of PAM. So right. I mean, Sesh, you're using break glass, but for me, that is the final last ditch effort.
Yeah, exactly.
You design your PAM system, so
you put high availability.
You never get there. Yeah, okay, fine, but it's a very, very rare occurrence.
Yeah, it's definitely steps and layers of protection. Like in Sesh, I think Sesh described a lot of the like operational layers that a company would put in place, but PAM products themselves should be, highly resilient,
Personally.
should have copies, should have the durability across, network outages or site outages or what have you. And mature PAM products can handle that in the sense that when you implement it the right way or in an HA kind of way, it gives you that resiliency against any kind of failure. Now, if all of your sites go out, I think you have a bigger problem than PAM.
There's a point that always
Let's
lost.
stop talking about single point of failure. What all things do you put in there? I mean, every single corporate account, what becomes vaulted? I mean, where do you draw the line on what goes in that becomes vaulted and controlled and goes into your control plane, and what does not? How do you?
So I would look at it from a risk perspective, right? What is the risk of a piece of information being let out, right? So a root account on a box that has a database with PII information or financial transactions, that's pretty high risk. A content server that has a read-only account that, not a read-only account, but like a basic account that can just publish content to it into a set couple of directories, probably lower risk, right? So you have to look at it from the risk plane and do an assessment of what your critical assets are.
So that's
build your program that way, yeah.
Goes into the governance plane, let the security analyst figure out, okay, here's my different risk profiles for all these accounts, and vault them and put the PAM to control things, okay?
Yeah, an account could be a Linux account, could be a database account, it could be a SaaS provider account, a third-party vendor account. Like it really goes to, a very wide gamut.
Chef Robert, do you want to add?
I think, Robert, go ahead.
Let's go for it. And when you do that, when you've done that analysis, you've also got, as we said, you start small. You start with your highest level assets, the things that are of most value to you. You start with those, and you then slowly build it out to get to the lower levels. So it gives you a way of tackling implementing your zero trust across the organization.
Yeah. I would say add to the two gentlemen, very good points made, is that fact zero trust is not an objective, right? Zero trust is a concept. It needs to be applied with a level of relevance, and I think that it is possible to take it to the extreme. And again, it has to be considered against the value and the risk, as my two esteemed panel colleagues elucidated. So that's the key.
So it's art versus science, saying not everything gets vaulted, but you have to bring in some experience, bring in some risk assessment, understanding. Okay. Before this last question, and I think we've got 8 more minutes, but one few things. We can't end the conversation without talking about the impact of pandemic. And in the last 2 years, we've been through all of it. And how is there how pandemic has affected how we look at PAM, zero trust? It may or may not. It may be just business as usual. Pandemic just accelerated it. But how do you see what has changed in the world of zero trust and PAM in adoption, or how the impact of it? So
I think it's been an accelerant, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, it's gasoline on the fire, right? I mean, companies were moving in this direction, and the ones that were resisting it, now that they have
help me understand what was the inflection point? How did pandemic become the inflection point for adoption? So it was
that perimeter, right? So that the perimeter that Sesha talked about that has gone away now at this point. We still have VPN and we still have security at the network layer, but that has allowed for more and more outside access to get into your world, right? And if you move that perimeter from a big outside shell into much smaller shells and even into applications and APIs, right, at its lowest layer, you have companies that were resisting PAM because of the cost of the project or whatnot are now being forced to go down that path simply because it's a way to survive.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what I'm seeing. I was Session and Robert. I'm not sure.
No, I agree.
I think the inflection point was basically the lockdown, certainly here in Europe, when people got sent home from the office and everybody suddenly had to work remote, and that meant the system administrators as well. Yeah. And at that point, what do you do? And that brings PAM into very sharp focus.
Okay. I'm going to go jump into a couple of questions that are coming in from the audience. Is the zero trust the end goal? will it be audited every step of the way? Isn't that productivity loss? So zero trust implementing a productive loss. Quick, I mean, it's what do you say?
Is it productivity loss? Let's take that from two angles, right? There's the productivity loss of the security team and what they're watching and monitoring, but then also there's the productivity of the user community that's accessing stuff through PAM. Zero trust is really the fact that there's no standing privileges and nobody's going to be trusted, even if you were trusted at one point in time, right? So yes, there might be a couple of extra steps that a user might have to take to log into somewhere or to gain access to something, but what it gives in a company is the assurance and control of both credential rotation, expiry times on certificates, if that's the preferred method, and those things help reduce the risk significantly. And so every customer, every company has to weigh the additional productivity loss on a per person, per transaction basis versus the risk that they don't have to buy an insurance policy for as much anymore, right? So like there's a business decision there, definitely.
It's like following air traffic controls. Is that a productivity loss because we're taking an extra loop around her?
Very good.
We could avoid a disaster, and so yes, it is a productivity loss, but it's a cost benefit analysis in terms of what
it's a risk reduction as well.
Risk reduction.
You hit the nail on the head.
So the PAM, there's a significant gap in today's PAM solutions addressing cloud environments, like we're talking about the Web of Trust and DevOps. As organizations are adopting more of the cloud and DevOps, what steps can organization take them in the interim to address their needs? It's an excellent question. That's the same thing about how PAM is or is not falling short in the cloud and DevOps environment. Robert, Sesh, and whoever.
Yeah, I think products are catching up. There's a lot of, as time progresses right now here, we're seeing a lot of capabilities now with the integration capabilities with cloud, being able to watch cloud accounts, being able to have ephemeral account, non-volatile account, CI/CD pipeline integration. These are all, every vendor in the space is looking into these, and there are emerging solutions, and I believe that there are solutions that are very viable today. And if not, there are a lot of hooks that are provided by many of these products that we've been able to, for example, use application kind of integration kind of concepts to build those out where there are gaps. The good point about it is that the privileged access management solutions, that we use today, are not closed systems. They are germane to expansion, and plus the vendors are keeping up, and I see that coming up quite a lot. And this is a use case. The cloud use case is, I think, paramount in all the vendors' minds, that they have now working towards it. And I'll let Joe, being a product manager, has definitely more better insights into that than I do.
Yeah, architect, not product manager. Just want to be clear on that.
Even more.
The interim steps that folks could take would be to, obviously have a strong review process. Don't do things like put credentials in source control and put it out on GitHub, right? That would be a really bad idea. Make sure you're reviewing the data that goes out to S3 buckets, right? That would be interim steps. It's manual, but as PAM continues to mature and we get different flavors of different types of tokens, authorizations, and policies and whatnot, really gaining that programmatic access to be able to grab those things when necessary, not tie them down to a point in time or point in time value, and being able to leverage them through the tools. That is building out. I mean, even if you take a look at like the CSI and Kubernetes, right? That's now an interface to be able to plug secrets in from third-party vendors, right? So it's maturing in the space, both the space itself as well as the tool sets, the DevOps tools as well as the PAM tools.
My opinion on this one is, I think, as you said, the governance plane and the controls plane. Often we look at controls plane to build governance policies, which is a upside down way of looking at things.
Right.
I don't think the governance model are mature enough to say, this is how we should govern our cloud things. And once you have the governance, implementation is simple, but looking at a PAM solution or any solution, any technology to solve your governance issues is a big problem, and that's where the failures happen.
Yeah, so I agree that is an upside down model, but if you look at it, right, you have a risk that you're trying to mitigate, which leads to a governance, which leads to a control, right? And if you look at it from that standpoint and start to ask yourself, in my DevOps pipeline, in my cloud environments, where are my risks? And with them, you can then say, okay, I got to cover this risk. That's your governance. Here's how I think I want to cover it. I want to have a manager approval. I only want to be able to access from our internal domain, right, our internal network, what have you. And then that leads into how, PAM can
technical implementation of it.
Right.
So it starts with risk. I would say it goes even before governance.
So sometimes when I see those questions, I see like, okay, tell me how PAM would help me reduce risk, and not like, here's my risk and here's my governance and here's my control. Like, show me what controls PAM has, and we'll put our risk policies accordingly. And that's what I was talking about, is like upside down model.
Yeah, no, start with the risks, because PAM can do a lot, mature PAM solutions are truly multifunctional. And while it may go from risk to control, which is perfectly fine, governance can be sussed out of that along the way, right? So as long as it starts with risk or governance, I think you're in good shape.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I agree with you, Joe.
Yeah. Sorry for occupying the answer.
No worries.
Perfect answer.
We talked about single point of failure. If privileges, if it's down, all is needed. Excuse me. Privilege access management seems to be a single point of failure. If it is down, all needed privilege access is locked down. What are some strategies to we talked about this, about high availability.
I think Joe, I think discussed this earlier. Right?
Yeah, we discussed
so
it. I'm just looking at
the sites can be disconnected, but yet still provide access and recording and all that other, all the other functions that it needs.
And then on top of that, adding governance policies with break glass and
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. The break glass scenario is in my mind, 6th or 7th, and in the line of defenses.
Yeah.
So,
last.
there's a lot of controls ahead of time.
Yeah. Nonetheless needed, but many organizations fail to do that, and that just may not be a good idea.
Yeah, we just on that point, we have one customer that had 7 sites of our solution put in there. And the question came up is, well, what if all 7 sites are down? And the answer from their executive was, we don't have a business if all 7 of our sites are down. We have other problems to worry about. So, to me, that was a good answer. It was funny.
We are over time, so just 1 minute to each of you. So, if you could just put out a closing remark and what you want the audience to take away. Here in Echo. So if you could just give us a 1 minute. A quick, what would you want to take away from PAM and Zero Trust from this conversation?
I can certainly start with when it comes to Zero Trust, it's a journey. It's something that you have to plan for. It's like an elephant. How do you eat an elephant 1 bite at a time? Then you have to work your way through it. But at the same time, too, PAM products and PAM vendors are really also consultant arms at the end of the day, right? HCL is certainly definitely a part of that, and when you have new use cases or new concepts that come up, you reach out to the folks, the experts, and maybe there's a piece of it that can allow for you to that PAM can solve for what you're trying to achieve.
Okay.
Yeah.
Robert?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Joe, the same thing. PAM is a journey. Zero Trust is a journey. You start where you are. You do a baseline. You find out, what are my highest priority assets that I want to, or highest value assets that I want to protect, and that's where you start. It for organizations, it can take 2 years. I've heard rumors there's been one organization that's been at it for the past 7. I don't think that's quite where you want to be, but don't plan to do it in a week. That's not gonna. You're just then setting yourself an impossible target.
Sesh?
Yeah, I would say that privilege access management is a critical step, because privilege access is going after some really high risk exposure scenarios, right? And you lock those high value accesses down, it's going to be a closer step towards Zero Trust, right? And so I believe PAM is a very important step towards the Zero Trust and as a vision, as an tool for an organization. I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, our time is up. We can go for another couple of hours with this. This is an interesting topic. So I'm kind of saddened to have this conversation. But thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for having me as a moderator. And Lisa, you can take from here.
Sure, I could listen to you guys go on for another few hours. So, we knew it was going to be a very dynamic discussion, especially with you moderating today, Aaron. So thank you so much. Again, special thanks to our moderator and panelists. Please check the attachments section in the event listing where you'll find additional information about today's topics. And if you have other questions or comments, you can always email us at enterprisestudio@hcl.com. And if we did not get to your question, you can also email us at enterprisestudio@hcl.com, and we'll make sure one of the panelists responds. So the replay of this session will be available on the HCL Studio Bright Talk channel, where IT and business meet. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.